Great. Well, welcome everyone to our next installment of our Aid in Higher Ed program. That's the Advancing International Development in Higher Ed program hosted by the Boston Network for International Development. We're so excited to be with you today during this particularly challenging time for many of us in this sector to share more information about what's going on and what this might mean for careers in global public health in particular, but also kind of international development more broadly. I'm seeing a lot of introductions happening in the chat. So glad to see a lot of folks coming from Bridgewater, Brandeis University at the Heller School in particular, as well as folks from MIT, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. We're so thankful for our 4 sponsors who sponsor and partner on Aid in Higher Ed. And we're so excited to be able to open up this really important conversation and information sharing to all students at this time. So let me just go ahead and introduce myself in case this is your first webinar that you're joining us. My name is Nanako Tamaru, and I am the Executive Director at the Boston Network for International Development, which we call BNID for short. And BNID is a network convener. We hold space for folks who are working in the international development sector, or for students like yourselves and job seekers who want to enter the sector as a place for networking, resource sharing, information sharing, stories of impact, just a place for all of us to get together who all work and feel passionate about things like global justice and international development, and to have a space where we can get to know one another and work together. And this, the Aid in Higher Ed program is one of our programs that we run specifically for university students, in which we're really hoping to tell you more about what it's like to work in this sector. And in today's climate, what are some of the challenges that we're facing, so that you know, as you're looking for your next internship, as you're thinking about jobs after graduation, so that you can make sure you have your eyes and ears open and understand the very rapid and big changes that are facing our entire sector that are literally happening as we speak. So today, actually, before I continue, if this is your first time engaging with BNID, I wanted to share 2 resources just so that we can keep in touch. The first one is to sign up for our newsletter. We send out a newsletter every other week, which and this is for folks who are based in Boston, of Boston international development events, job openings, internship openings, cool things that are happening, great resources that are out there. So recommend that you sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. We also have a membership program. Let me just pull this link off the web. We have a membership program for folks who are students, but it's mostly for graduate students. I know some of you undergrads can say that's not fair, but we are a professional network. So we're looking for folks who maybe have had some experience in the international development sector, went back to grad school, are getting kind of some more credentials and experience and network. So in case you're interested, if that sounds like someone like you, we encourage you to consider getting a student membership. Again, our membership program isn't really geared towards students. It's geared for folks who are already doing work in this field, who are interested in networking with folks, as well as building skills, having kind of discussion groups about what's going on, talking about hot topics in international development that we all as practitioners need to stay abreast of. So that's just 2 ways that you guys can keep in touch if you're interested after this webinar. So today we're all coming together to talk about careers in international development and global public health. We have one amazing panelist joining us today, Michelle Helman, who is a consultant at the intersection of health and peace innovation. I'm really excited to hear more about Michelle and her work. We had another colleague, Chloe Delheen, who was going to join from Partners in Health. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us today, but she did give me some resources and materials to share with you all, what they'll do at the end, as just ways to kind of keep in touch, as well as ways we can take action at this exciting, I guess, tumultuous time, perhaps a better word, a tumultuous time in our sector. But before we talk with Michelle, I thought, with so much stuff going on in the news, you probably have seen a lot in your news feeds, I thought, let's go ahead and start by just framing the scene. what is happening right now? You might have heard a lot of chatter, again, in various news outlets, on LinkedIn. I know my LinkedIn feed is just full of just comments and resource sharing. So I thought, why don't we start with a quick presentation on what's happening right now, in order to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page as we dive into this conversation. So let me pull up my slides again, and we'll dive right in. I'll be talking about the USAID shutdown and the foreign aid freeze and the implications of everything that's happening. So a lot of stuff has happened over the past 3 weeks or so, but I'm just going to give a couple highlights, and then I really want to spend a lot of time breaking down for you all, what does all of this mean, right? For people who are working in the sector like myself and Michelle, as well as folks like you who are maybe looking for jobs and internships. So we're going to start on Inauguration Day, back on January 20th, with the executive order that President Trump signed. So this executive order, titled Reevaluating and Realigning United States Foreign Aid, said a lot of things, but I think this might have even been the second and third paragraphs in the executive order. Two things to take away from this are, one, that foreign assistance will not be dispersed unless it fully aligns with the president's foreign policy. Which, as we've seen other executive orders come out, this kind of tells us that, sorry, something weird just happened on my computer. This tells us something, as we look at the other executive orders, you can guess that things like programs related to DEI, the LGBTQIA community, climate, immigration, some of these hot topics the Trump administration is really against, will probably, if there are any programs related to those, will probably be cut. But we don't know yet what that means, but this is just a blanket statement that was made. The second really important thing that was in this executive order is it called for a 90-day pause in development assistance in order to assess programmatic efficiency and consistency with said foreign policy. So what we're seeing is it was a 90-day, we're calling it a stop work order. Literally, letters came down from various US government agencies saying, if you are a grant recipient, you have to stop work immediately, and you are not allowed to proceed working on these grants for at least 90 days. Or for 90 days, I guess is the correct language, for 90 days, while the US government goes through and assesses what are these grants for, what are the programs, what are their outcomes, and whether they align with President Trump's foreign policy. So that came out on January 20th, and then kind of over the next week or so, the letters came out to all the grant recipients. The Trump administration did offer, you might have heard about waivers. So they said, if you are providing life-saving aid, you can apply for a waiver, and then if that waiver is approved, you can still continue to get funding. The pause will not apply to you. And some waivers were approved, but based on what I heard was that, as we'll get to in this next point, is that because there's really no one at USAID who's currently working or has access to systems, the payment system was down, for example, even if you got a waiver, there was no one to process your payments. So the waiver didn't really mean much for many folks, just what I've heard kind of down the pipeline. So it all starts on January 20th with this, what we're calling the foreign aid freeze, or a pause order that came down from the US government. The next thing that started to unfold was the purging of US aid. So USAID is one of several agencies that distributes foreign aid. Probably I don't know the exact budget breakdown, but obviously the Agency for Development is a huge player in that space. So starting around, there's no exact start date, but around the start of last week, it started right after the executive order came out, that people just started getting laid off and put on administrative leave. I think right away I'd heard from someone who I had reached out to and was really interested in speaking on this panel, who worked at USAID. She wrote me the next day and said, I just got fired yesterday. So right off the bat, they let go of about 500 contractors and put a bunch of people on administrative leave. In some cases, people didn't even know they were on leave until they tried to log into their email and were locked out. So just kind of mass across the board, a lot of people unable to access their work, told that they were on administrative leave. If you look in the news, there's a lot of estimates, but of kind of how much they plan to reduce the size of USAID. But some of what we're seeing is, there's around 10 to 13,000 employees and contractors at USAID. They're hoping to get that down to somewhere between 300 and 600. So they're going to reduce the workforce to about 2 to 3%. You might have seen just recently in the news that a judge put a pause, an injunction on some of the people that got put on administrative leave. That was primarily folks who are overseas, because there are thousands, actually most of USAID staff is stationed overseas, and they were given 30 days to pack up their entire personal lives. Some people have been there for years, pack up their lives and come home. And this particular judge felt like that was not necessarily safe or fair and could have severe consequences. And so we put a stop order on that. The next we'll hear about that is on the 12th, so on Wednesday. But the injunction is until it gives everyone another week. So until Friday, there can be no more people put on administrative leave. So that's kind of what's happening there. But in general, there is just USAID has been gutted effectively. There's not a lot of people there to do that assessment and analysis of the grant. So I just talked about that was mentioned in the executive order. So 90-day pause on foreign development assistance to assess programmatic efficiency and consistency. For the USAID, there's no one really there to do that assessment. So there are a lot of questions about what that means. But effectively right now, the agency there's not anyone in there. They're not allowed to go into the office, and many people are locked out of their accounts. And so we don't really know what this means, and we don't know what this means for folks who received grant funding from USAID, but we'll see kind of what happens. And you might have heard there are many different lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration for various aspects of whether that's the foreign aid freeze and its implications on life-saving aid, whether it's the kind of dismantling of USAID, whether that's constitutionally within the administration's power. Those are all kind of in the court system. We're waiting to kind of see what happens. So that's kind of where we're at. I think that's where the action has brought us so far, is this executive order, the 90-day pause, and then the kind of administrative cutting of USAID. So that's what has happened. But I think what's really important, and what I wanted to explain to all of you today, is what the heck does all of this mean? Like, everybody is up in arms, everyone's freaking out, but like, what does this actually mean for folks like you and folks like me who work in the sector or are looking for jobs into the sector? Well, the first point is that, as you probably have heard or probably already know because you're interested in this work, the US government, we are the single largest aid donor in the world. The US disperses around $50 to $75 billion a year in international development aid or foreign assistance. And that's not just out of USAID, that's also Treasury, Health and Human Services, the Millennium Corporation, Challenge Corporation, and many others. So this is kind of across the government. So there's $50 to $75 billion worth of aid that's over the course of a year, but all of that has been frozen. So you just imagine, how many malaria vaccines, how many AIDS treatments, how many latrines, refugee camps, food deliveries, like you name it, right, is $50 to $75 billion worth of work that has just been paused overnight. It's a quite stunning, the implication, the human implication, right? The folks who were receiving this treatment, these services, this life-saving aid in many cases, and the taps have been shut off overnight. So there's a lot of programmatic impacts, but because today this is a career panel and we're talking about careers, I'm going to be focusing on what does all this mean for people who are currently working in this field, as well as people who are looking to enter it. So as I said before, the stop work order took effect immediately, and community organizations all over the world were negatively impacted. Programs stopped overnight. And what that meant was, and I'll kind of break this down in a minute, but that many staff at these organizations were laid off or furloughed because the organizations, all of a sudden, there's no more money coming in. And if there's no money coming in, how do we pay you your salary? Like, where does that salary come from if we're not getting the funds that the government had promised us? So just a bit of terminology. So laid off is kind of like being fired, right? It's very permanent. It means like, I'm really sorry, but we have to let you go, and you no longer work for us. That's laid off. That's permanent. Furloughed is like a temporary version of that. You might be on a 30-day furlough, essentially like it's leave without pay, and then maybe in 30 days, if this all gets resolved, you can come back and resume your job as before, but it's kind of like a temporary hold. And so a lot of both individuals, people doing this work, as well as organizations have been directly impacted. I want to go through a couple things. And again, if you've worked in the international development sector, this might be stuff you already know, but for some of you, this might be something that you're interested in, but don't quite know how everything works. So I want to give you a sense of what does it mean when we say this 90-day freeze, and why is it such a big deal? Okay, so we're going to walk through an example. So here, let's say USAID gives out, they went through this whole grant proposal process where they said, we have $50 million we want to give an organization, and they went through the whole grant selection process. They chose an organization. They want to give out $50 million to advance health, education, and poverty alleviation, specifically in the Horn of Africa. Now, typically for these big grants, like $50 million, the aid recipients who get it are these large, we call INGOs, so just really large nonprofit organizations. Folks like World Vision, CARE, Oxfam America, like some of these really large organizations will get these really large grants. So imagine that this organization got this $50 million grant. They receive the funds. They're not going to get all 50 million at once, but it'll come in smaller disbursements. They'll receive the funds. They'll keep some of it for their own staff. A lot of times these large INGOs have both a headquarters office, sometimes in DC or New York or wherever, sometimes in Europe. So they'll have a headquarters office, and they might have a country office that also gets some of the money as well to pay for their administrative costs. And then they'll subcontract, meaning they'll get maybe, let's say, 3 to 5 partner organizations within each country to actually carry out the work. So World Vision might say, okay, we want to do a children's malaria vaccination program. But we need some specific smaller partner organizations who are in that country, right, to actually deliver, to actually go out and do all the shots. Right, and to actually organize these clinics and do the work on the ground. So that's kind of what they do, is they'll get this big chunk of money, they'll hire or they'll contract on a bunch of smaller partner organizations who will actually do the work. Okay, so in this case, there's only one here, but imagine, right, if it's in each country, let's say they're working in 2 countries, that's maybe they bring on 6 to 10 different smaller non-governmental organizations. Sometimes they're called community building organizations, local organizations, just nonprofits in that particular country. And so those organizations take those funds that they got from the large INGO, and they'll use it to pay their staff, to fund the clinic, to get the shots, to do, all of the costs that are part of creating that malaria vaccination clinic, or running a school, or whatever part of aid that they're working in. Also within this process, there might also be some independent contractors or consultants hired for specific tasks. And this is kind of where we'll hear more from Michelle in a little bit about what it is that consultants do. But sometimes these are just individuals who will come on with this particular technical expertise. They'll lend to the project. So this is where not organizations, but individuals also can get looped in. So this is a very common project structure that we see in the international development sector. There's a big grant that gets passed down from whether a government agency or someone else, goes to a large INGO that then gives contracts out to smaller implementing organizations in the country to actually do the work. And so kind of the dollars get passed down at each stage. So what happens when there's a 90-day pause? So here, that $50 million grant, it's paused. There's no money coming down. There's just nothing coming through. Everything is effectively stopped. So what that means is that the INGO all of a sudden has no cash coming in to pay for its headquarters staff. Everyone's salaried, right? So if you're salaried, you're getting a paycheck every other week or every month, no matter what. And so they have to pay for their salaries. They have to pay the rent on their offices. They have to pay for their Zoom subscriptions, right? They have all these costs, but there's no money coming in. So there's some financials to figure out. Both, perhaps there's going to be a financial hit taken both at the headquarters and the country offices. Same for, so let's say 1X for headquarters, 1X for a country office. Then we go down to the NGOs. They were waiting for the disbursement of funds from for the supplies that they had bought, their staff salaries, all the time and effort they've put into kind of constructing this and, doing all their outreach and all of that. Well, now we see that there are, again, if we say that there were maybe two countries working, Ethiopia and Somalia, now we're seeing that each one of these individual organizations, right, are now taking a financial hit. They maybe can't pay their staff. They don't know how to recoup the costs. They've got these vaccines and they have to store them, because if they don't store them properly, then they won't be good in 90 days, right? So each organization also takes a financial hit. Also, contractors who were hired, myself have experienced this, where all of a sudden the organization comes back and says, we can't work, and so therefore we can't pay you. So all of a sudden these contractors or consultants aren't getting their paychecks either. So it ends up having a real domino effect, that when the money stops coming from the funder, it's like any job you have. You work and someone pays you. All of a sudden the payments stop coming, then everyone else down the line who is expecting those payments also gets impacted. So when we talk about what is the impact of this 90-day freeze, we're seeing just a domino effect from funder all the way down to smaller organizations and individuals, not getting the money that they were promised, and not being sure if and when that money will come. Because again, the government has said that they're reevaluating these grants. And so everyone's guess is that some of these grants are going to go away and are going to be nullified, while some might come through. But I want to show you a couple of graphics from globalaidfreeze.com. And what they have done is they have a survey open right now, and organizations and businesses that have been impacted by the global aid freeze can complete this survey. And so they're gathering data. And so far, 568 organizations have completed the survey. And a vast majority, it's like 450 of the 560, are nonprofit organizations. And so they have a couple of great graphics I'm going to share with you all. But the first one is the percentage of organizations' budget affected by the stop work order. This bar right here is absolutely staggering. So somewhere between 80 and 100, let's say 90 organizations that have completed the survey, 100% of their budget has been impacted by the stop work order. Every single person's salary has been impacted. Every aspect of their organizational budget has been impacted by the stop work order. And that's scary. That means that probably their main funder was the US government. And I'm hoping that they'll be able to survive 90 days without getting any payments. But as you'll see on this next graphic, same survey, same data set. If you look over here under nonprofit, over 50% of nonprofits only have 1 to 3 months of reserve funding. So what that means is they can only survive 1 to 3 months without getting any money in. So for of these organizations, that 100% of their funding is from the US government, 50% of them will run out of money in 3 months. So what do? You furlough your staff, but you're like, just so you know, we're probably not going to be able to bring you back on. And we've already seen organizations close. We've already seen some just say, we are operating on a shoestring budget, and we just don't have the reserve funds to make it 3 months. So we don't know what to do. So it's just a big reality. There's another website, and I'll put this. Actually, I should put both of them in the chat. This is the link to globalaidfreeze.com, which is where all of these graphics have come from. And then this is another great website with some more information, USAIDStopWork.com, where they are also collecting information about job losses due to the global aid freeze and the US shutdown. They only have 67 organizations that are reporting, but so far, there are 11,000 jobs that have been lost in the United States, and over 50,000 jobs have been lost abroad. And that's current, like those numbers are current. These organizations are reporting that, we had to lay off 50 people, 500 people. Those are the numbers that we're seeing. So far, to date, again, just for 67 organizations reporting, 11,000 jobs have been lost just here in the United States. So even though it's just a temporary freeze, we are seeing some real impacts happening as we speak. And then I think this is really important information for all of you. What programming is being most affected? And again, this is organizations that have self-reported, but the three big ones are health, governance, and gender. And I'll say, and I work in gender, so it really hurts me to say this. In particular, the Trump administration's really sharp rhetoric around things like DEI and LGBTQIA rights. I think that a lot of these gender programs might also get slashed in the longer run. Like after the 90-day pause, they just won't come back. But again, we don't know. This is just kind of trying to read the tea leaves and guess what's coming. But this again just gives you a sense of who is being impacted, which is mostly nonprofits, which is not a surprise, and then what sectors we're seeing that have been impacted. I think that might be, are there any slides that come after this? No, that is all the information to share to date. And I know it's a really grim picture. And I felt as I was putting together these slides, I thought, wow, like it's really hard to see in such concrete numbers, but I don't want to sugarcoat it for you. Like I want you to be eyes open and aware and understand what's happening and what this might mean for you, folks that are looking. Maybe graduation isn't that far off, and we really don't know what things will look like in May, but I really want to make sure that you are aware so that you can start to make your own plans and make informed decisions about what you're going to do, what we're all going to do, because this is, again, having some real world impacts on all of us. So with that cheery, rosy picture that I just painted for you, I wanted to, sorry, one second. I wanted to transition from talking about kind of what's happening big picture to talk about what this actually looks like. So I've given you kind of some general examples. We've walked through some of the trends that we're seeing, from many organizations reporting back about how they're being affected. But I thought it'd be really helpful to put like a human face on what this is like. And so Michelle, I'd love to bring you in at this point to talk a little bit about what it is that you do. Let's start there. Let's start about what is the amazing work that you are doing in the international development sector. And then we can talk a little bit more about kind of all of the news that I just shared and kind of how you're seeing that unfold in your job. But why don't we just start? Let's start afresh. I would love to hear more from you and what you're doing and what kind of exciting work you've been working on in the international development sector.
Super, just checking that you can still hear me okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, of course. And I'm gonna work a little bit backwards here and share and model a resource and invite folks who are comfortable to turn their videos on so we can see all the brilliant brains and hearts that are in the room. You're not gonna have to talk or do an activity or anything, but if you're comfortable turning those videos on so I can see who is here in addition to just your names, that would be amazing. And as you're considering that, I'm also going to invite everybody to just feel yourself where you're seated. Let your shoulders relax a little bit. And I do this for myself as an offering for you. We're going to take 3 breaths together. That's a lot to take in, right? So let's just be together in this. So inhaling and exhale a little bit slower. Another inhale and exhale. Once more at your own pace, breathing in. Great. So, pro tip of a grounding and centering technique when you hear information that can be overwhelming in the midst of uncertainty. And like I said, I do that for myself as well. So no worries if your camera doesn't work, but thanks to those folks who did turn it on. Thank you for having me here. So a little bit about what I do, and I'll kind of keep it short at the beginning, and then I think we can go from there. But basically, I work as an independent consultant at the intersection of peace, innovation, and health equity. I am also a doctoral candidate doing my research on the same topic. My master's in peace and conflict studies was also focused on peace and health. My undergrad is in anthropology, and I think that type of resume information you can get from reading my bio. But the point being is that these topics are extremely important to me and what my passion is, more than just what's on the resume or the title, but because I'm a first-generation immigrant. I was born and raised in the U.S., and I've had the privilege, honestly, to do a lot of international work. And in doing my work, have been working together with people across cultures, ethnicities, you name it, fill in the blank differences, working together towards a common goal, and really seeing the challenges, the necessary challenges that come up in trying to achieve those goals, even before the stop work order. And through my career, much longer story short, I noticed where some of my own learning gaps and opportunities were related to what I was seeing happening in the field and people that I was working with, particularly related to monitoring and evaluation of how do we know if this is actually working, if there are billions of dollars, or even if it's a $5,000 project, how do we know what we're doing is actually working? Or even a better question, like what is actually happening? Because sometimes it's not even about proving if it's working or not. So that I really found an angle into shifting away actually from nonprofit work back in 2013 when I was a staff member, and committed to my own professional development and higher education. And it was actually somewhat accidental that I became an independent consultant as I was finishing my master's program and searching for work by networking, which is what I would recommend as a pro tip of a way to look for jobs. As a footnote to this is through networking rather than just applying to things off of the ad that you see. As I was networking, and what happened was just a few months before the pandemic, just after the murder of George Floyd and everything else that was happening in the US at that time, and organizations that were going through culture change, whether that was related to DEI or other topics, even conflict, for example, we're starting to say, hey, we're really committed to this, but we're not quite sure how to do it. Or we're coming across obstacles that are really inhibiting us from moving forward in a way that we envision, and we need some support, and we're ready to ask for help. So thankfully, finally, somebody with my skill set and background was like, hey, I have some more purpose and value here that seems like it's a bit more aligned given the times. And in order to accept a contract with a city government, I had to register to open my own business. And I had done independent consulting before, but didn't necessarily have the intention to go for it on my own. Yet because of the context and the needs, that's what happened. And I always say fortunately and unfortunately. I wish there wasn't a need for my work, but thankfully there is. So I have a career in supporting organizations to navigate that planned and unanticipated change and develop their leadership and communication skills to be able to navigate those changes. So that is a little bit about me in a nonlinear story and what I do, and I think I can probably detail out some of that as we go through the questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for the intro. Could you give just a really concrete example of like how you've worked with one of your clients as an independent consultant?
Sure. So I'll just say also I've worked with like funders when we were looking at that domino effect. I've worked with organizations at the funding level to the grassroots level of NGOs and CBOs, community-based organizations. So let's say a funding organization in this case is committed in their policy and practice to conflict resolution, conflict transformation. How to be doing that with equity and justice in mind. Yet their practices that they have in place are not necessarily supporting that change to happen in a way that's not punitive. So I'm able to then work with the HR department and other leadership to think about and use a design process and model that I have developed to better understand what is going on, what are their goals, their needs, their obstacles and opportunities, and how might we develop a process to support them in addressing some of those goals or reframing what those goals are so that they can move forward through the process. And that can a lot of times looks like coaching and thought partnership with some of the key players, or other times smaller groups or teams, training, facilitation, supporting them to learn their own facilitation and communication skills, because often we're getting 5 steps ahead by trying to implement the change rather than looking at, okay, what are some of the ways that we can support ourselves in even just navigating that change process to design it.
Great, thank you. I think it just helps to like make it a little bit more concrete.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll share another example. So since Chloe wasn't able to join us, I'll kind of pop in and share a couple anecdotes as well. So like Michelle, so I am the executive director of BNID, but I'm also an independent consultant as well. And my work is similar. It's in kind of peace building, conflict resolution, and social inclusion and gender equity. So, and my work is, I would say, because your example was kind of like within an organization and kind of walking the talk and doing kind of that internal transformation. My type of consulting that I do is kind of what program staff do. For example, was brought on by a client, which is a large INGO, to create a community of practice for community health workers working in conflict affected communities or communities affected by violent extremism or the threat of violent extremism, like where ISIS was doing active recruitment or where far right neo-Nazi groups were doing recruitment and where there's a lot of tension. And so for me, the client hired me to create essentially a program for how do we help equip community health workers and community leaders with the ability to support one another in this really difficult work, because especially for the community health workers, they're there to do health. Like we aren't here necessarily to do some of the community development or conflict resolution stuff. It fell outside of their wheelhouse. And so we wanted to create a community of practice where people could share, this is what's happening in my community. Like, how would you respond? What have you guys done? What programs have you put on? What have you seen be effective? So that's just to give you an example of what an independent work looks like. It really depends on who the consultant is and what their specialty is. It could be working within organizations and helping them to improve and have more impactful work. It could be really working with the communities and designing programs together with an organization, a client, in this case, a client organization for a particular project. So just want to give you a sense of kind of what different types of consulting can look like. But Michelle, would love to know, so I gave, again, that whole really depressing spiel about what's happening right now and how people have been impacted by the executive orders and what's happening over at USAID. And just curious, in your own consulting work, how have you been, or how has your work, and perhaps you as well, been directly impacted by everything that's happening?
Thanks. Yeah. So there's a few different layers to this, and I appreciate you mentioning and you as well, because it does impact everybody as individuals, even if you're just one reading the news. There's a real impact on that. So at that more personal level, there's like overwhelm, confusion, frustration, hope, fill in the blank, a lot of emotions going on. At more of an interpersonal level, I know colleagues and people in different various countries who are impacted in different ways, and so there's a lot of like empathy and thinking about what does mutual support look like in terms of continuing to prioritize and foster relationships, because for me that's really at the center of it all. And on a work level, for example, I through the years of doing this, I have sometimes an organization that might call me and say, "Hey, we're thinking of applying for this. We need a subcontractor, or we have received this funding and we need a sub." So I'll do sub work or primary contracting work as well. Although, just as an example, in the past couple weeks, I had somebody reach out to say that they're interested in having me to support with some of the evaluation of a program that had already happened. Two reasons why this was challenging for me. One is arguably, in my opinion, having evaluation as an afterthought isn't necessarily helpful compared to building it in throughout the process to better understand how something is working rather than just if it's working, because then you come to a problem like we saw before with if you don't have an impact, it's going to be if you don't have a demonstrable impact, it's going to be hard to get more funding. And when there's no funding, there's not really a lot of space there. So I've actually shifted away from a lot of solely monitoring and evaluation work, even though I think that's super important. Because then the next day after I had responded to their email, they said, curious to even still have a conversation with them to learn about that approach and what flexibility there might be. The next day they emailed and said, "Oh, the opportunity isn't even listed anymore because of all of these cuts." So even if there would have been potential work to contract there, that was swept away through everything that's been happening. And then I think one more layer that I'll share to this is over the years of doing this work and having a lot of critical reflection about the system in itself and my place in it, I've actually shifted to doing a lot more US based work because I think there's a lot of opportunity for eco-social justice to be happening wherever your feet or wheels are on the ground. So a lot of my work right now is focused on supporting different communities and organizations in Oregon, where I'm home based, and then through my doctoral research with a nonprofit in Kenya, but because I was invited in by them, never in an extractive way where I am imposing anything by me, but always with a co-design collaborative process based in relationships. So fortunately, because of the professional and lifestyle I've created over the past few years, I'm still able to have the privilege to move forward without experiencing extreme crisis because I'm not dependent on that funding stream in a way that somebody who might be full-time employed is, although I am certainly impacted, like I mentioned. And again, that does come with through the privilege and the work that I've done and the choices and the challenges that come with the type of work that I do anyways. So I'm still figuring out how to adjust and navigate a bit as well, though I'm a little bit removed from that direct domino pieces necessarily. So
Yeah, so just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. So as an independent consultant, you are both doing work for organizations that are based, doesn't matter where they're based, organizations that are doing work in the United States related to health, equity, and peace innovation, as well as organizations that are doing work abroad. So you've kind of got a diverse set of projects and things you're working on.
correct. Yeah.
Great. That's awesome. And it's probably a great way to keep the work really interesting too.
It is.
So by contrast, all of my work as an independent consultant is international facing. So all of my work currently is focused abroad. And I have one primary client. This is a good reason to diversify your funding streams. I have one client that I'm working with primarily, and as of right now, their two biggest programs are funded by the State Department. And so I got a stop work order 2 weeks ago. They got the letter from the State Department, I want to say like on like the Saturday or Sunday, like the 26th or 27th. They got the order, no, to 26th, which was a Sunday, that we had to stop work on Monday, that we weren't allowed to come into work on Monday and couldn't bill. So what that has meant for my organization is that the salaried staff, we still have to pay them. They still get their salaries. No one has been furloughed, thankfully. We have enough of financial reserve to be able to carry on for a little while. But people are not doing much because those were our two biggest grants. And so there were some workshops we were going to hold. Those were canceled just because the State Department doesn't want to see that we're continuing work, even if we fund it ourselves. And so that has been very much quashed. And for me as a consultant, the really sucky part of being consultant is I only get paid for what work I do. I'm not a salaried employee. So I have no paycheck until the State Department comes back and clears the project and gives it a green light to continue forward. So making sure that I have my own financial safety net is important. But I think we all knew the Trump administration definitely said that they wanted to shrink the amount of foreign aid that the U.S. spends, but didn't think it was going to come this fast. So it still has come as a pretty big shock. So for me as a consultant, I'm definitely feeling this. On a personal level, I'm struggling. I'll be really honest. There are some days when I look forward and I say, will I even have a job? I've spent the past 15 years of my career dedicated to this. Am I gonna have a job in 6 months? Like I don't know. And I'm not trying to be like, it's just like the honest feeling. Some days where it's really hard to go on. And then other days I talk with other folks that are in the same place and we're like, no, like this fight is not over. Like we're still fighting. And then we're out there calling our Congress people, sending out letters, like talking to the press, like mobilizing, doing whatever we can because we're not going to go down, without a fight. So there's just like from a personal perspective, I feel like I've hit like all the range of emotions. My family has seen me go through all the stages of grief. It's just such a shock, and it came as such a blow. And so I think we are all kind of processing it as it comes and just trying to kind of hold on for the ride because we really don't know what's going to happen. Right. And work is still continuing. Sorry, I should also say, like, we're talking about US government and, sure, they give out $50 to $75 billion a year, but there are tons of other funders, right? Other government funders, huge foundations, corporations, and they're still giving out money and they're trying to fill in the gaps and like create emergency funds. So there's work still continuing. It's just that the closure of USAID and just the sudden stop of the funding has just been felt by everyone, even if you aren't working on a US grant, you just still feel it through your colleagues and through, again, all your socials and news feeds and everything. But unfortunately, I have felt it quite personally. But I'm hoping that, we'll remain hopeful because a 90-day pause does not mean cancellation. So anyway, that is my story. But Michelle, I'm just curious. So I'm so glad to hear that kind of you have a diverse portfolio, and so you're kind of weathering the storm with different types of projects, which is so great to hear. But I'm sure, and I'm seeing this question come in the chat. So this question is like really well timed here. Is that so? In light of everything that's going on, and all of your great diverse experience that you've had in the international development sector, what advice do you have for students who are looking for jobs and internships in our sector? I mean, I just painted such a bleak picture like we must have some silver lining or some ways that folks coming into the sector can find ways of doing great work. What advice do you have?
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of things come to mind, and one is actually building on the end of what you were just speaking about of the zooming out to realize to not be as US centric necessarily. Remember that there are other organizations and people doing this type of work or similar work that might not be using the exact same words, but that might have similar values, intentions, processes, etc. So the importance of that diversification, diversity in even just perspective to be able to improvise and adapt and iterate as things are changing, because even without this stop order, while it is extremely severe, things do change anyways, because maybe there's an organization that's reliant on funding from a different funder. In my case, I was just working with one on healing-centered peace building. Their funding was cut, and they had to drop half of their staff. And so we were working on how do you navigate this unanticipated change to still stay sustainable in a new way. That what does sustainable look like? So anyway, just that as a point of being curious, hopeful, honest, flexible, adaptive, and iterative in that approach. I think more specifically in terms of job searching, so the job searching, as I mentioned before, personally, and what I've learned from other mentors that I've worked with is this emphasis on networking and relationship building. I don't have recent statistics on it, but I've heard previously that only a low percentage, less than 50% of available jobs are even posted online. And if you're just clicking and sending out resumes and covers letters responding to that, you're one of however many people applying. That might be successful. I'm not saying don't do that by any means, but where I have had success, and again, this is aligned with my values and approach, is networking to build relationships with people who are working at an organization or have a role or experience that lights me up in some way. And I have a coffee chat with them and I learn about it, because sometimes what's on paper or on the beautifully designed website might look really different than what they're actually doing on the ground or in the office. So again, depending on everybody's lived experience and context and financial situation, you don't always have as much luxury or as seemingly luxury to just like spend a million hours networking, when in the end of the day, we need to pay our bills because this is the current system that's designed. The opportunities that are available, I know there was a link shared about newsletter and local events, getting involved locally as well. I think taking away from a lot of the things that were hopefully learned during the pandemic around community and that resource exchange from people that you already might know, and you never know what can happen from a conversation. I've had contracts and work come up where it was somebody that I spoke with 2 or 3 years ago that said, "Oh my gosh, you know what, Michelle?" And then they call me and I'm like, "Yeah, here I am." So that doesn't solve my problem, if I needed a job tomorrow, but just to say, having a longer term strategy. And then my other final point about this, unless I have another idea that comes to mind, is also having a pause to reflect on why you are interested in working in this sector. And looking at kind of with a critical view of, if the dominoes fall as they will, and there's such a dependency that has been built because of this structure, is that actually supporting locally led work in a way that is intended? Maybe not, and that's probably a whole other conversation and an article that I'm writing that I'll share once that's out. But I think it's worth asking yourself what you're interested in, why. And that's not to say you shouldn't be interested in this sector. I'll just, with my example of, I was interested in monitoring and evaluation. I started doing more professional development and study and focus around that. And therefore that led to more work, because I was understanding the things that I didn't see working about it, and I tried to learn to be able to design it differently. So I would say, if you can, take a little bit of time to reflect, to network, and then hopefully those new dominoes fall in a different way as it starts to become clear what you're looking for and why, and trusting those relationships will help you build that path forward towards that. And then the end of the day, if you do just need a job, consider what other jobs are available to be able to continue paving that path. So when something opens up that is more dream job aligned, then that's available.
Yeah, I love that advice. Networking and meeting folks is, you probably hear us say that a lot. Your career advisors and others say that a lot. But it's true. I'm also seeing, I don't know if you guys ever look at the jobs that are posted on LinkedIn, and it'll tell you how many people have applied for that job. The numbers are staggering. Like, World Bank posted a job recently, and like within the first day, there were 200 applicants. So if you're not one of those first, I don't even know, 200, are they even going to look at your materials? Like that's kind of tough. And so that's where the networking thing starts to come in, is that then someone there, and they pass your resume directly to the hiring manager and say, this person is really great, and you might get into that stack, as opposed to being one among 1,000 applicants and hoping that the algorithm will pick you. So yeah, definitely networking is always a great place, or a great way to also just learn more about what it is that people are doing in this space. Folks that seem like they have really cool jobs, message them on LinkedIn and say, I am a undergraduate student, and your job sounds really interesting. Like, would you have time for an informational interview? So I could learn more. People love to talk about themselves, and people love to provide advice, and so that could be a good way to get to know some more folks. But also just know that when you're messaging folks like that, it has a low return rate. So like every 10 messages, maybe only one person responds. It's not you, it's just that people are busy, and sometimes you just get lucky, you break through the noise. But just that, again, reinforcing that networking and using your alumni networks in particular, because they're already there, they're rooting for you, they want you to get jobs. Alumni networks and your career services office can be really, really a great resource for you to use. I put
Can I add a quick footnote to that?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry to interrupt. Because I like where you're going, and something that I've learned as a recipient of many coffee talk requests and as a requester, being as specific as you can with the questions that you're asking. So I just received an email from somebody, I'm really interested in international development and gender. Great start. A little bit more specific, so that I can know who I can refer you to or what resource I can share, because I'm happy to do so. I can't necessarily have a meeting with everybody that emails, but I'm very happy through, I know somebody just posted that PCDN newsletter, other information, you just start to hear of what's happening and who's doing what. And following and seeing who's funding what, and you can look at websites to see who are they getting funded through, and being as specific as you can with the ask with those questions. I would add that. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I get messages all the time. People are like, I'm interested in international development. I'm like, that can mean literally a million different things. Like, I need you to be more specific. So the more specific you are, the better, for sure. I included some resources in the chat of just things that I've seen. Obviously, I didn't put DevX. I feel like everybody looks at DevX for jobs. But 2 additional resources. So NickatNoon, Nick Martin, I don't know him, but I think he posts great stuff on LinkedIn, a lot of different jobs that are out there. What I like about him, and it's similar to what Michelle said, is it's social impact broadly. Like, most of us are interested in public health and international development because we want to help people, right? We're here to have contribute to the common good. So social impact jobs is just a little bit broader. Like, as we've said, like, a lot of organizations, I think at the end of the day, are going to end up closing because of everything that's happening. And so there may be fewer opportunities and more people looking for jobs. And so, as you're looking, you might consider, as Michelle just said, like, what exactly is it that I want to do? What really draws me towards international development? And you might find that there are other jobs within the social impact world, whether that's work happening here in the US or work happening internationally that look interesting. And so looking at, instead of just international, like DevX is just international development, but like NickatNoon, PCDN are more just social impact minded. And so you might find other opportunities that might speak to you that are not necessarily with international development, but have skills that you can easily transition into a different job or into the sector at a later date. And as I said before, like with all of this happening with the US government, the impacts are being felt across the sector, but there are tons of jobs still out there, and my LinkedIn is like blowing up with all the people that are hiring. But two places that you may not have thought of that you might consider, because oftentimes I talk with students, they're looking at, you know, the World Visions and the CARES and the Save the Children, of the big names that they know and they've heard of and they've grown up with. But other places you might consider are corporations, which is crazy, but a lot of corporations have ESG programs, CSR programs, whatever you want to call them, that are doing good social impact jobs. Some of them have foundations that are attached to their corporate entities that are giving out funds. So that might be a helpful way to think about getting out of that just the NGO and nonprofit world. And the other one, which Michelle mentioned, is funders. So that might not be the US government, but perhaps looking at foundations. Bill and Melinda Gates, of course, is a huge one for public health, but there are not just the Gates of the world, because they're, again, a really big one that are always competitive to get those jobs. But there are a ton of family foundations and other networks out there that either do work in international development or social impact more broadly, that are not going to be impacted by what's happening with the US government. And so I just think that, yeah, stuff within the corporate sector and actual philanthropy or funders could be another place to look while we wait for the dust to settle on what's happening, because 90-day aid freeze will only let up just before graduation, just before summer internships. So we really don't know like the full fallout and impact of everything that's happening. We won't really see it until this summer. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you might want to have a backup plan of doing something that excites you, but may not be your dream job, but will help build the skills that you need to be able to then transition into the international development sector.
Can I just uplift
something
something you just said also? I'm like, yes, yes, yes. I just want to repeat, in case anybody missed it, the importance of looking, like diversifying who you're looking at, because those skills can be transferable, especially for undergrads who might not have, who are maybe building that experience, and even wherever you are in your career, because there are valuable skills to be learned that can be applied perhaps internationally when that might open up again. And something that I didn't mention that I think might be useful in some cases is my inroad to the sector was also after my BA in anthropology in 2005, I think it was, that I graduated. I became a Peace Corps volunteer, and I lived in Peru for 2.5 years. And that was extremely formative for my professional work in the US and abroad. So again, that wasn't necessarily, didn't set me up for generating a ton of income, but that wasn't my goal at the time. I was still able to sustain myself. So if there are opportunities to volunteer or do something where you might not be getting paid as much, but it still excites you and there's valuable skills to learn, just kind of looking and weighing those pros and cons of what you might be able to learn and glean from an experience, knowing, trusting that that will lead to something else in the future. And again, understanding privilege and power comes into place, and not everybody can have the luxury to volunteer, but that doesn't mean once a month or once a quarter you can do something for an hour or two, or, you know, there's ways to make it work without saying, oh, I don't have the time. So just as another, which supports networking and your CV as well.
Yeah, great. And then there's just so much happening in the chat. I cannot keep up with all of it. So maybe this is a good time to open it for Q&A, since a lot of the questions are related to jobs. As I catch up reading on the chat, does anyone want to go ahead and ask a question while I scroll through the chat and catch up on the questions? You can just raise your hand and we'll happily turn to you. Okay, well, I found a first question in the chat here, which Michelle asked you. So someone's asking, as a recent grad, any advice for getting an entry-level job overseas? Is it realistic? And some practical advice would be appreciated.
Ooh, I don't know if I have a concrete answer to that. I think I would draw from a lot of the recommendations that we've provided in terms of networking, because it's hard to say without knowing like what type of work or organization you're interested in. I know some organizations, again, this is kind of the, in my opinion, challenging part of the sectors. There's internships. Are those often paid internships? No. If you get lucky, there may be low paid internships, but it's a way in. And I think that's related to Margaret's question about working your way up. It's this looking at taking a step back and looking how the system is designed. It is challenging. It is challenging, and to find an entry level job, I can't totally speak to that. I'll think about it a little bit more, and if I have a better, more useful idea, I'll come back to that. Just to be honest.
Yeah, I'll say from my perspective, what I've been seeing in the sector as things like decolonizing aid and localization come through, is that a lot of entry-level position jobs that are overseas are now being. They used to kind of hire internationally, or a lot of American INGOs and nonprofits would hire Americans and then send them abroad. Now they're actually hiring nationals in that country, so local staff to do some of those jobs. So I think that it's getting harder to find those overseas jobs. That's just a trend, and that trend has been happening, well before all of this came down. So that's just kind of what I'm seeing, is that some of the entry level positions that are based here, like at headquarters jobs, oftentimes nonprofits in particular want to hire Americans or people with work authorization already, so that they can work here in the US. So sometimes the entry level jobs at headquarters are going to be easier for American students to get. Just an observation. Chrissy, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, yeah. In a slightly different situation, myself also personally impacted by all of this nonsense. So, feeling a lot of similar feelings. But I kind of just curious for like someone like me who's got a little bit of experience in the sector and kind of wants to, ideally in italics, continue a career in development. Just because that's kind of where lion's share of my experience is at. Like what advice would you have for someone like me? Just kind of how to move forward here.
Want me
So
to go first?
I'll just say something really quick, and then Michelle, I'll hand over to you. If you are joining this call and you have recently lost your job or that have been impacted by everything that's happening, there are actually like a ton of resources available for you. The LinkedIn link that I put in earlier, like there's a ton of, and I'm taking advantage of them too. Like there's a ton of free coaching out there that coaches are like, oh, did you lose your job? Like, let us help you, like with all these resources. And I think that, in a way that people are like looking out for folks who have been directly impacted. So in a way, there are a lot of resources and opportunities that you will uniquely qualify for that maybe some of the folks that are just entering the sector won't. So in a way, it's kind of a nice time for people in need of resources. But I'll find a LinkedIn thing and put it back in, which you might have also put in. But Michelle, I'll hand it over to you while I look for that link.
Thanks. Let's see. Well, I think just I forget the word for it. It's hard to provide super specific advice without knowing more of your beautiful lived experience context. And two things come to mind. One is kind of these breadcrumbs I've been talking about, really defining like what does development mean for you? Why are you interested in it? And then what do you have to offer based on the gaps and opportunities that you see, and trying to curate a little bit of like what is your place in this ridiculous story of things. So, if there's some opportunity for pause and personal reflection, and maybe that's through the support of a coach or another program or an alumni association, then finding some of those answers within you through that relational experience, that's what comes to mind.
Thanks. We'll do just a couple more questions. Feel free to raise your hand like Chrissy did, or I'll keep going through the chat. We have a question from Margaret, who says, how would you advise those of us who are early in a career to balance moving up and advancing in your career with the corruption in the development and public health sector? In her experience, the few positions have required, this is terrible, have required me to go along with some horrifying corruption and exploitation to survive or move up. So just asking for any advice on kind of how to navigate that. Any thoughts, Michelle?
Wow, Margaret, yes. Hopefully you are able to navigate that and have other resources and support if any of those experiences are, whatever the impact of those are, number one. And number two, and again, without knowing more about your specific context, what comes to mind is, are those really the people that you want to be spending 8 hours of your day with? And who do you want to be spending 8 cherished hours of your day, 5 days a week with? And even when you do find those people, there's still going to be conflicts and challenges, but hopefully more on the side of the spectrum of people who are willing to work through it rather than corruption and not looking at it. And so it does take time, and that's not always, it's maybe easier said than done. I've had a million different jobs and changes, and still some days I'm like, who are the people that I'm actually doing this work with? And right now that feels far away, and there's like 2, right? And so I think it's a matter of maybe looking for those, again, I keep coming back to like relationships and allies, and depending on where you're at within an organization, of course, leaning to, HR or whatever processes might be necessary to support if there is any type of abuse or something happening. It doesn't sound like that's necessarily your experience, but I would take that as a red flag. And then, that same question of what are you interested in doing, and how might you kind of adapt that to make it so that it can work and be sustainable and joyful and fun, because it's very serious work, health, peace, development. And my motto is also, we can have fun while doing it. And I work with conflict all the time. And that's what helps keep me going with it.
Yeah, I would just echo that, I know jobs are hard to come by, but and it's really a personal decision about whether you feel like you can continue. But I think, just in my opinion, I don't think it's worth doing the work to have to experience and witness corruption and exploitation. I personally would leave the organization if that was the case. There are so many organizations out there that are doing good work. Every organization has its challenges, but when it comes to corruption and in particular exploitation, especially of the communities that you're working with, that's a red line for me. And I would definitely, again, finding jobs takes a long time, but that would be an absolute red flag, and would cause me to leave, and would say that there are many organizations out there doing good work that you don't have to suffer through something like that just to get ahead. So, and yeah, it's just about finding the right place for you with the right team and the right culture, and that can take time, and can, it can take a few bumps in the road. But again, it's a personal decision. Any other questions or anything we might have missed in the chat? These are great. I feel like you're all asking some really interesting and tough questions.
See one in the chat.
I see one last.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you please tell us that can a person also get a job in international organization without references? Our references are important, and sometimes whenever we fill the application, they do not ask for any kind of reference letter or like that.
So your question, just to make sure that I got it, is about references. So do you need references for a job? What do you do when job applications don't ask for references right off the bat? Is that correct?
Yes, yes. I mean to say, do we need, is it important for us to find a reference, or sometimes when we apply for a job in international organizations, or we can also get a job in international organization without a reference? I mean, if you have a strong CV, you have an experience of administration and management of developing country and health, but is it important that you must have a reference to get a job in international organization?
Yeah, I'll speak from my perspective, and then Michelle, feel free to jump in. So for some international organizations like the UN, like the World Bank, OSCE, sometimes they will require you with your CV to include a reference letter. Some international organization positions are weird like that, but on the whole, I would say more often than not, you are not required to submit a reference letter. Oftentimes, if you get to the final round of the interview process and you're one of maybe one or two final candidates, they will ask you to share references so they can. It's just a checkup. Like, we're going to call these people and say, do you recommend that we hire this person? Are they actually good at their job? Are they reliable? They might go through a process like that, or have them. I've filled out, for example, like quick surveys online about applicants. So I would say for the most part, you just need to have a few people, former bosses, former professors, or someone that can speak to your ability to work and be reliable and what skills you have. And that usually doesn't come until the very end of the hiring process. Anything to add, Michelle?
I would
The,
just add that I
uh,
think it's a great idea that a way to vet an organization if they're not asking for references. I would have a question mark of why. And this comes back to my point previously around networking and relationships, to maintain even somebody that you might think might be a great resource, to let them know that you're applying for jobs. What a great excuse to reach out, start your networking tomorrow, draft a couple emails to professors or bosses and say, I'm going to be looking for a job in 5 months or 5 days or after I graduate. I'm hoping that you might be able to be a reference if that's okay. And also, if there's anything that comes on your radar, please keep me in mind. Boom, boom. Like you've done that,
Yeah.
2 in 1. I think JD in the chat also had a question.
Yeah. I'm going to come to that one last.
Okay.
Which maybe is right now. In terms of your question about networking, so excuse me. In the chat, we have a question that says, do you have any recommendations for finding networking events in Massachusetts, or do you know of any networking events or career fairs in the Boston area? So this is where I'm going to put into the chat again the link to sign up for the BNID newsletter, which comes out every other week. We host 2 networking events a year that are specific to international development. The people that come to our networking events, if you haven't been to one yet, are folks that are either doing this work and based in Boston, folks that, or people that maybe have done the work, people who did Peace Corps, but it's just like a community of like-minded folks that gets together and just likes to meet one another and chat. So we do 2 networking events a year, one in the fall, one in the spring. This spring, again, we're just waiting to see what happens with all the turmoil. We're hoping to hold a networking event, but it might end up looking something a little bit different. I'm trying to think if there is anything else. There are, for example, World Boston has a ton of events. They've got like chat and chowders, things with authors presenting their work. It's more international affairs focused, but I feel like international development, international affairs are like a Venn diagram. And at every single one of their events, there's a networking portion afterwards. So the panelists will talk, and then afterwards there's like drinks and snacks and networking. So I would just highly recommend one of their events as well. They happen like every month. They're constantly doing events. There are also other organizations like, for example, Need Global, that's more kind of on the funder side of things. But if you're interested in getting a job in philanthropy, they're another great place. They hold events all the time for funders or people who are interested in becoming funders that might be interesting to go to. I'll plug a few of those into the chat. Michelle, any other thoughts to add?
Yeah, just more in terms of strategies. You're more familiar with the Boston area and the state than I am. But, you know, just as you've offered, here's the newsletter, there's going to be events, I would say to people listening, like, say yes and show up. It might not be the professional group that you're part of for 5 years, but go to an event, you'll meet people, and maybe there you have your ask or your pitch beyond just I'm looking for a job, but saying, I'm looking to use my skills in XYZ. I'm looking to learn about XYZ. And then through those conversations, people might say, oh, you know what, go to this group or this group. The other one quick thing about that is I would value the local library and wonder if there might be also resources. That librarians are huge resources for questions and knowledge and answers. So considering they might have events there or help you to navigate and point yourself in that direction, in addition to different chambers of commerce, Rotary, Lions Club, other alumni associations, and just the organizations that might be doing somewhat similar social justice work, or fill in the blank with whatever you're interested in, and signing up for their newsletters and learning about who's doing what. And you'll at least learn what you don't want to attend, and then hopefully that'll lead to what you do want to attend.
I put a couple more resources in the chat. One I'll add, SID Washington. They're based in Washington, D.C. But they have a career fair every year, and you can also attend it virtually. And it's a discounted price. So just a nice way. And of course, DC is where a lot of organizations are based. So it's just a great way, again, to do some of that career connecting. I'm sure there are other career fairs out there, but I just know I've attended the SID one virtually, and they have got some great stuff. And it's pretty affordable for just the virtual portion. Great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. We've just peppered you with all kinds of questions and some really tough ones. So thank you so much for just your willingness to come chat about, in this stressful time and to make the time. I really appreciate it. I also just realized that so we had another panelist that was going to join us, Chloe Delheen from Partners in Health, and she did send through a message. So I wanted to copy some of the information into the chat. So Chloe works as part of their economic justice program at Partners in Health. She gave me her email address and said if any students want to reach out to her, she's happy to meet with folks to talk about the work that Partners in Health does. She also shared with me 2 action items and things that you all might be interested in. First of all, they had a webinar recently about how the funding freeze is impacting Partners in Health, USAID, PEPFAR, and other global health entities. So you might want to check that out if you're interested in just understanding more of kind of, again, what is going on and how this sector might be impacted. And then the last one, which I would love to close with, because I think this is an action that all of you should take tomorrow, the next day. I'm calling every other day, but call your congressional representatives, your senators and your representatives, and tell them that you are looking for a job in international development and you want it to be a sector that still exists in 3 months. And what irreparable harm to communities that this funding freeze and USAID shutdown is having. So that's kind of, many people are encouraging congressional action. It might be kind of the only way forward if the lawsuits don't work. So Chloe shared this wonderful link that provides a script and the phone numbers. It doesn't matter if you're based here in Boston or elsewhere. call and just let your congressional representatives know how you feel and how you're feeling impacted, and what you hope they can do. So it's, oh yeah, 5Calls is such a great app. Someone just recommended it to me and I haven't downloaded it on my phone. It's just a great way to make those connections. So call more than once. It's a little scary the first time, but then you realize that they're very nice and it's very straightforward. So and what someone told me recently, which I thought was really helpful, is that you want to call more than once, and you want to call, if not every day, as many times as you can, because what happens is the congressional offices, they collate, because they get calls all the time, what topics are rising to the top and what most people are upset about, and they use that to set their legislative agenda. So if a lot of their constituents are calling about USAID, about this foreign aid freeze, and concerns about the impact, right, it rises to the top of the list. I know that there are a lot of things happening in the world right now, but it would just helps, again, raise awareness within Congress that these are things that as constituents you are concerned about. So make those calls. And again, the world continues and we're all still trying to do the good work. And international development will survive without USAID and without USG. It will just look a little bit different. So wish you all the best of luck as you start to navigate this process. As I said, we don't know what things will look like, but we'll all still be here in 6 months doing the good work. So thank you so much, Michelle, for everything that you shared with us today. We so much appreciate your input and just willingness to hold space for all of these questions that's happening. So thank you again, Michelle. Thank you everyone for joining us, and please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.